Joins us, Director of Municipal Policy at the Show Me Institute. Good morning, Patrick Toohey.
Good morning. How are you?
One of the rules here at the Big 550 KTRS is not to dress nicer than the host.
I apologize.
So you've broken rule number one. I also need you to talk right into that microphone.
Very good.
There you go. All right, so you want to talk about Airbnb.
Yeah, it's a fascinating new industry that we're dealing with in Missouri, and lots of cities and towns are trying to figure out how to regulate it.
Right. Why would you want to regulate it? It's a fine business. It's going along nicely. Why do you want to regulate something like this?
Well, I think the first answer is you've got the hotel industry that has to pay taxes, that has to deal with regulations. Even Airbnb are regulated, and so they might say, hey, why aren't we treating these newcomers the same way? And then you've got people who live in neighborhoods who are concerned that Airbnb will bring crime, will bring traffic, and they don't want their neighborhood's character to change.
So let me get this straight. I want to impose my philosophy on my neighbor's property.
Oh, look, people always want to spend someone else's money. That's as old as time itself. But that's it. And so I've been looking into the research. I have not found any research that indicates that an increase in short-term rentals, Airbnb, VRBO, creates crime. I have found that the presence of those services in a community raise everybody's property value.
Huh, that's interesting. Now, why would that be?
Well, so I was kind of thinking through this, and I thought to myself, would I want somebody next door to me turning their house into a short-term rental? I've got kids. Am I worried about that? And then it occurred to me, a person next to me who's generating income from their house not only will upkeep their house, they're going to want me to cut my grass and rake the leaves. And so I think what happens is people clean up the houses, they turn them into revenue streams for themselves. It brings in I think Airbnb short-term rental people are generally wealthier than the average.
Right.
It brings those people in, and so it becomes a showcase for the neighborhood, and everybody does
well, and
it's
also has people out and about, and there's sort of activity if you're on a street where no one's coming and going.
That's right.
There's more people out on the street, therefore you feel safe. Therefore you feel safe, and so you'd walk out to make it more safe.
But I think part of the concern is this kind of NIMBY idea. You know, you hear a lot of we'll say older people who have lived in the neighborhood since the 50s or the 70s, and they say, I don't want the neighborhood to change. Yeah. And so they are the resistance.
Now, the legitimate argument, the same thing, sort of the Uber argument, is that, hey, wait a minute, taxi cabs are highly regulated, and they can't do all sorts of things where we're allowing the new economy to sort of come in and do all the things we're not allowed to do, right? So Airbnb doesn't have, there aren't the taxes on the Airbnb that the hotels are being forced to pay.
That's right. And I think a lot of short-term rental people would be fine if they had to charge a 7 or 8% tax or pay the hotel tourism tax. What's fascinating to me is if the house across the street from you becomes a rental, and they rent it out for a year at a time, they don't have to tell you. The city doesn't tax them, doesn't assess them as a commercial property, doesn't inspect the house. That you don't need permission. But if you want to rent your house out for 3 days instead of 3 months, all those things may come into play. I think the legislatures have to figure out, how do we tell a short term from a long term?
Right.
And maybe a lot of the regulation we've had for years on hotels and bed and breakfast should just go out the window.
I will say this. When I go to New York, and I usually use hotwire.com, the website, and it's a sort of a discount hotel place that sells their unused inventory. And you get like a room for $100, and the taxes and the fees are also $100.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
It is stunning.
That they are, same with sort of car rentals in like airports. It's exorbitant, the amount of taxes an individual pays when they rent a hotel room.
It's the same story here in St. Louis, but in Kansas City, if I want to rent a car, I will go across state line into a smaller neighborhood on the Kansas side where they don't charge all the rental car fees, the stadium fee, all that type of stuff. What's exciting about this Airbnb is, I think, and that kind of technology is it's challenging hotels to think differently. And the answer to providing better services for consumers is to lower regulation and let everybody fight over this rather than have government come in and either ban Airbnb outright, which some places in Missouri have done, or regulate it into non-existence.
Is any place doing it right? Is any place like forward thinking with all this?
It's such a new technology. You know, we haven't had a lot of case law. There's a law professor at UMKC who says that any ban is a takings, an unconstitutional takings, but nobody's taken that to court yet. It's so new that we don't have an awful lot of research. But in Missouri, you've got outright bans from Ladue and Kansas City to kind of areas around the Ozarks.
So I didn't know that. Ladue bans you turning your house into an Airbnb?
That's right.
Huh.
You can't do that at all.
That's interesting.
And so it may be somebody who owns a property there says, you know, this is unconstitutional, but we haven't seen it yet. I suspect, like Uber, this will end up in front of the General Assembly.
Yeah.
The state will take a look at it because you're going to have so many differences.
Well, and what's the conservative, what's the liberal point of view on this? It's sort of all over the place.
So what's interesting about this technology to me is it's a lot of people who are not ideologues, right? They're not necessarily politically conservative, but they've got a house, they want to rent it out, and all of a sudden they're running into government telling them no.
Right.
And it's a huge market for kind of libertarian small government to educate people because their experience, a lot of times with Uber, you want a good libertarian, talk to an Uber driver.
Right.
They understand government trying to shut them down and cronyism.
Well, right, but then you talk to the person who owns the house next door, who is, government, get off my back. Hey, wait a minute, government, why don't you stop that Airbnb over there?
And I know some people who are rock rib conservatives in Kansas City who don't like the idea of Airbnb. They want to tell their neighbors how to use their property. So it's exciting because it shakes up kind of our traditional alliances.
Is there a difference between an Airbnb that rents a room in a house versus the whole house?
So that's what cities are trying to figure out. So they look at it as far as whether the owner lives, owner-occupied rental, about how many days a year they rent it out is another threshold. And,
right.
And they're looking at all of that,
right.
but they haven't figured out.
Well, they had boarding houses years ago,
right.
where you would rent out a room.
Right.
And this is sort of the new technology of that.
That's right.
Personally, I don't want to rent out a room to somebody who I have a locked door. I'll rent the whole house.
I tend to agree with that.
But I won't rent the room. I don't care how cheap it is. I just don't want to be living in somebody else's house while they're there.
That's right. And I wouldn't want somebody else living in my house while I'm there.
Right. It's a weird world. But I mean, boarding houses were very common back.
Well, in fact, you make an excellent point, which is the short-term rental market has been around for decades. What is blowing up are the internet platforms that allow us to rent and find them so much faster. So government has to regulate or react to an old service that's blowing up because of technology.
Patrick Tuohy, I always make good points on this show.
Thank you.
It's my show. Director of Municipal Policy at the Show Me Institute. Do you know how Airbnb got started?
I don't.
So the guys who started Airbnb wanted to, they moved out to San Francisco, and they wanted to start a company, but they didn't know which company they wanted to start. But they knew we have to go to San Francisco because that's where all these tech companies start.
Okay.
So they go out to San Francisco, and they got buddies out there. And so the first night they're in town, they're going to stay at their buddy's house until they come up with their really great idea. And so their buddy says, you're never going to come up with an idea. You're an idiot, but whatever. You're happy to stay. You're my college roommate. And he says, well, where am I going to sleep? He says, I got you an air mattress. Here, blow it up. There's your Airbnb. And the guy was like, you know what? That's not that crazy of an idea. You could rent out rooms, and we could start an app, and that's how it got started.
That's brilliant. What a great story.
The first night they went to San Francisco to find their dream. Their buddy's like, here's your Airbnb. Now I'm going to bed.
And now they're suing each other over the rights to the name, I'm sure.
And there you go. Patrick Tuohy, we can find out more about Airbnb where?
Go to our webpage, showmeinstitute.org.